Hi, here we are with Doris Lessing. We have the short story To Room 19. Now, Doris Lessing brings us, at least in my opinion, to much more current times. While she, of course, passed away in 2013, there was a time when I was teaching this class when she was alive. Okay? So while I can't call her one of our living authors, she is certainly at least what we might call contemporary. When I think of what she's doing, in some ways, she belongs to a much bigger field of writers writing in the post World War II era, what we call the post war era. We always refer to World War II when we mean that, when we say that. And the kind of critique of the suburbs and the newfound middle class prosperity, whether it's on the American side or the English side of the pond. Right? And I can think of a lot of American writers who ventured into this field. You think of from Philip Roth, John Cheever, folks of that nature. But of course, Doris Lessing is a woman, and she is interested in the experience of women in the post-war world as well, right? Which is not the same as the experience of men, of course, in many different ways. Right? In some ways, right, we look at her character, Susan, as a type of a success story, right? If you think about where Mary Wollstonecraft was coming from, or Elizabeth Barrett Browning writing Aurora Leigh, and what did they want? What did they want for their contemporaries? What did they want women to be able to achieve? Well, it looks in many ways like Susan has that. But that, of course, raises some interesting questions, which I would like you to think about and consider as you're reading the short story. I mean, what is the place that Susan occupies in the world as an educated, upper middle class woman in the post-war world? What is that place? Right? It's something to really think about. When I think about Doris Lessing, just to go back to her for a few moments, right? Uh, she's primarily known, I think, for her novel The Golden Notebook. And if you read Greenblatt's prefatory notes, as of course you all do, right? So you'll know that. She is interested, though, in the problems of the independent woman, right? Because independence, or at least the appearance of independence that the post-war woman seems to have acquired, still comes with a lot of baggage, a lot of expectations, socially derived, culturally derived expectations that a character has to deal with, maybe sometimes more successfully than others. The word I'm thinking of really is trap. Is Susan trapped? How is she trapped? Right? In her world. And what becomes of this? Right? It's something I want you to think about. Lessing is looking at the suburbs. I love one of the things I love about To Room 19 is how the suburbs are portrayed, and particularly the home of the Rawlings, where they live, in a Garden of Eden-like way, right? Uh, let's put it this way, right? Doris Lessing writes in a very realistic manner. Um, it's not experimental or anything like that. It's pretty easy to read and understand. But the allusion, the reference, if you will, to the Garden of Eden is persistent and clear. And if there's one thing that the Garden of Eden is all about, it's loss. It's not about living there forever. It's about losing it. Right? That's what the story of the Garden of Eden is, a story of loss. Right? And for Susan, what does this mean for her? Right? She is lost in a certain way. There's no question about that also. Right? I want you to read the story on your own, but together we can take a look at the first sentence, because this is one of those opening lines that, well, quite frankly, tells us a lot. This is a story, I suppose, about a failure in intelligence. The Rawlings marriage was grounded in intelligence. Now, one of the things that I like to look at is that word suppose. It's like the word seems. It qualifies a statement. So, for instance, when the narrator says, I suppose, there's a lack of certainty. Is this a failure of intelligence? The Rawlings marriage was grounded in intelligence. And that's, of course, a very surprising statement, I think, for many of us, first time we encounter it. Because, marriage is based in love, or at least economics, or cultural tradition, something. This is a marriage based in intelligence. I think we kind of relate in some ways. Maybe you know, certainly wouldn't have experienced yourself, of course, but maybe you know people who rushed into a marriage and everybody around them knew it was a mistake. Oh my God, why are they getting married? For heaven's sakes. And given the ability to get divorced in our own times, very likely it wound up in divorce pretty quickly. You say, well, of course they were too young, or they weren't well matched, or they come from two different backgrounds. They're too different to sustain it, or they wanted too many different things. And so people on the outside, I'm just saying, might look at that and say, well, that was not a very smart thing to do. You can't say that about the Rawlings, Matthew and Susan. They're pretty well matched. If you're looking for, a rational or intelligent match, right? Those two characters, at least at the start of this story, seem very well matched, right? Very well matched. But I love that line about a failure in intelligence, because I know for many of us readers, the first time we read that line is a little bit of revulsion. You go, well, you're not supposed to base a marriage in intelligence. But in the next breath, as the author, as Doris Lessing takes us through, we do see examples of, well, what we wouldn't want. The rushed marriage, the desperate marriage, right? Those kinds of things. And we kind of see, okay, yeah, I get that. I get that. Of course, always easier to see in somebody else's life, right? And so what you look at that sentence again, especially maybe after you've read the entire story, maybe the second time through, you go, wow, I get it. And yet there's a qualifier, suppose. Suppose is one of those words like seems. Takes us away from that very solid is or was and puts it into something a little bit shakier, right? We're not quite sure about it. And that's why that's one of the issues I've asked you to think about with this particular work, this story. It's about that question of failure. What kind of failure is this? There's a lot of different failures going on, right? So as you go through to room 19 and we think about what happens in the kind of, I don't want to give things away, but the glide path, if you will, of the marriage, where it kind of goes and sort of descends. In the story of Matthew and Susan, but most especially Susan, of course, because it's really her story. Where is this coming from? How could it have been avoided? Because it looks, again, from the outside, like this was a well-made match. They seemed like two decent people getting together, and it seemed like, oh, of course, these are perfect. And they have the 4 perfect children, boy, girl, and then twins, 1 boy, 1 girl. They even have a helper, right? Like in the Brady Bunch, Alice. They're not wealthy, but they're well off enough, right, to be able to afford a nice home, regular help, good schools. In the United States, we often use the expression the white picket fence. We don't see a white picket fence literally in this story, but you might think of it in that way, or Pleasantville, right? If Pleasantville has a demon in it, right? Hope you enjoy this story.